So good morning. For those who are joining us on the live stream, we've got a good number of people. I was curious for a while how many people are going to come in person. These models of educating in the age of pandemic offer, each one offers its own challenges. But I think that given the progress being made with case numbers, that we're ready to move to more in-person programs like these. So I really do want to encourage, first of all, thank the people who are here in person and hope you're feeling good being here. It is easy to attend in person. You just show up Monday mornings. We're not requiring registration or anything, just double vaccination, which I'm sure is the case for the vast majority of our congregants and our guests, but you don't have to be a member of the shul to attend the program. And there's some benefit in being here in person because I can entertain questions and comments, which is, to me, half the fun of doing these classes, because it takes me out of what I've prepared and often causes me to think deeper about some subject. And if you're here in person, you can bug me with those questions and comments. I always will leave some time at the end of each class, whereas through the live stream system, there's really no way of communicating. So I want to encourage everyone who's in the class to join us in person as much as you're comfortable doing so. I think it's a better experience. Just a couple of announcements regarding how we're doing the class. Make sure that you're subscribed to our daily emails, because sometimes last minute something pops up. It's the nature of my job, and we have to cancel a class. So you will find out about that only if you're subscribed to the Beth Tikva email system. And if you are not currently subscribed, just send an email to Ricky at bethtikvatoronto.org, or you can email me or email anybody in the shul, and we'll figure out how to get you subscribed to the email list. This class on Pesach is, according to my calendar, going to run weekly through December the 6th. 9:45 a.m. for about an hour, and then we'll leave 15 minutes for questions. So we're going to, just went dead. Testing, 1, 2. Back? Okay. So we're going to run right through till December the 6th, and we'll see after that. We'll see where we get. You never know how far we're going to get through the material, but I'm at least scheduled every Monday morning until then. All of the classes, some people say, well, I have a doctor's appointment, I have a dentist appointment. Rick, all the classes are going to be recorded, right? All the classes are going to be recorded. They're not going to be available on YouTube, I think, but if you just send me an email, we'll send you the link so you can watch the class. That way, even if you have an appointment or something, you can follow the material that's been covered that day. What I said before the class, I would warn everybody. This is the first class. There may be some technical issues, so be patient. We should get them all fixed, and there you have some background noise, and I hope that's as bad as it gets for today's class. But by next week, they should all be solved, and please feel free to always send me feedback or questions through email, jrgrover@gmail.com, or whatever other email address you have for me. They should pretty much all work and all go to the same place. So let's talk about Pesach. You probably, since you saw the topic, were wondering what my wife was wondering, which is why I would cover Pesach in October. So here's what I want to say about Pesach. I'm not sure if people really understand and appreciate the centrality that the story of the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt plays in Judaism. Most religions have some foundational myth. And by myth, I don't mean fanciful tale. I mean myth as in story. Most religions have some central story that really animates its character. And I would say a central story that allows you in a few sentences to encapsulate the core of that religion. For Christianity, it's the crucifixion of Jesus. There's no question that that is the central story. The Gospels are basically all about the crucifixion and Jesus being resurrected. In Islam, it's Muhammad receiving the Quran, the revelation from God. In Buddhism, it's the teachings of Buddha, and I'm not an expert in Buddhism, so you can Google that. But in Judaism, even though we have a Torah that has many different stories, when God introduces himself to the Jewish people in the Ten Commandments and commands loyalty, God says, I'm the Lord your God who redeemed you out of Egypt. Out of all of the stories that God could have told, God could have said, I'm the God who created the world. I'm the God who saved Noah from the flood. I'm the God who called upon Abraham to leave his land, etc., etc. God chooses, and it's, I would say, consistently, to identify himself always as the one who redeemed us from Egypt. That is clear if you look at pretty much any page of the Siddur. Maybe on about more than on any other page of the Siddur, you find one theme. God is Ga'al Yisrael, the Redeemer of Israel. In the Shema, Asher Hotzeti Etchem, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. Over and over in the liturgy, that means at every prayer service, we mention that God is the one who took us out of Egypt. So any assertion, I'm saying this because an assertion that you can only learn about Pesach in the spring is clearly ridiculous, because this is not just an event. It happened to have occurred in the spring a few thousand years ago. And there's a specific holiday that remembers that event in the spring every year. But it is a story that we are required to remember every day, and that animates Judaism every day. So many of our beliefs and holidays and rituals and principles and laws, all animated by this story. So much so that even what day it is in the calendar, we're going to cover that today. We only know that today is the whatever day. I don't even know what day it is of Mar Cheshvan. I think it's the 10th, but don't quote me. Whatever day this is of the month of Mar Cheshvan, that's all because of the Exodus from Egypt. I'm going to explain. So it's always a good time to learn about Pesach. Always. Especially because as I said, I'm not sure we all appreciate the central role that this myth plays in Jewish life. Because there are so many other stories that we hear that are read from the Torah and the Haftarah. It's a big religion with many books, many stories. Sometimes sometimes we focus too much on the breadth and not enough on those stories that really play the central role. So my goal is to make you all experts in this story. Specifically so that when it comes to this Pesach, whether you've attended one lecture of mine or all of them, you're going to feel like you're opening the Haggadah with a much greater appreciation of what the Haggadah is and the holiday that you're actually gathered to commemorate. Because hopefully we're going to have a normal Pesach this year. And I'd like the students in my class to be able to sit down and say, I get this. And not just I get this, but I'm going to use a traditional Haggadah, a real Haggadah. I went into the Jewish bookstore a few years ago with Rabbi Sachs, and we were trying to find a Haggadah that was appropriate for a community Seder that we were having, and it was really hard to find one. Because all the Haggadahs now that are popular have abbreviated so much, removed so much from the traditional Seder. And I understand why. It's because the way most of us come to the Seder is we've spent a lot of time cleaning out the chametz from our house, preparing the menu, calling the caterer, making sure we know who's coming to our Seders and who's not, and where we're going the next night. That becomes the focus. And then when it's time for the actual Seder, we open up the Haggadah, and that's our first encounter with maybe the most important, I think, the most important holiday in Judaism all year. Like we sit down, and then that's the first time we've had to look at it, unless you've come to my pre-Passover lectures before, which I hope you have. It shouldn't be that way, right? And I hope it won't for those of you who are attending this class, that you actually will sit down there and say, I get this Haggadah now much more than before. I don't need to use the Harry Potter Haggadah. I can use a real one. And maybe even if I don't have time to go through everything, we can have some discussions at our table about some of the themes that I learned with Rabbi Grover in the Haggadah that I didn't even know were in the Haggadah before I took the class. The Haggadah deals with the biggest questions of life. The nature of freedom is obvious, but so much more. All of the challenges that I think we question today in society. The role of government, the role of the individual, the nature of servitude, the nature of love, the nature of justice, etc., etc., the nature of family. All the big questions that we probably confront on a daily basis are brought up in the Haggadah in one way or another. We just aren't prepared for it when we open up the book, so we skip to Manishtana and sing some songs, which I believe, by the way, is also important. I will get there. I'm not mocking the singing of the songs. I think it's really important. But just don't forget that among the depth of the Haggadah are these important questions about life that the Haggadah asks us to confront every year. So here's what we're going to do for this class and maybe a few more. This is my strategy. I don't think it's possible to understand the Haggadah without first reading the invention of Pesach in the Torah, directly from the Torah, in chapters 12 and 13 of the book of Exodus. While it would be nice for us to open up the Haggadah, and I tried this when I thought about this class, I tried the idea of maybe let's just bring our Haggadot and open them up and start from page 1. But I don't think we can do that without first opening up the Chumash. Then, when we open up the Haggadah, it'll make a lot more sense. Because we understand that the Haggadah is just an outgrowth of the central story of Pesach, which is told in the book of Exodus, as I said, chapters 12 and 13. So those of you who are here in the shul have the benefit of a chumash right next to you. Those who are joining at home, I hope also have a chumash somewhere in your home. But if you don't, that's okay, because you're online. So if you open up google.com and type in Exodus 12, you will also be able to follow along with us, even if it's just an English translation. You'll also be able to follow along with us for the next few classes as we jump right in and read in depth perhaps the most important psukim in the Torah, the psukim that introduce the Jewish calendar, that introduce the holiday of Pesach, the psukim that Rashi says, the great commentator, he says the Torah could have just started here. Right? That's the importance that Rashi gives to these chapters. It's like for him, the Torah could have begun here because this is where the story of the Jewish people really begins. So, does anyone have a page for Exodus 12? In the Eitz Chaim Chumash, it's 318? 380 if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash. By the way, I have in my notes, this is not, while I'm introducing Pesach as the central myth and certainly the most important holiday in Judaism, there are many academics and others who will say that it's also the most important story in Western civilization. Just to tell you how important it is for us, Jews, the ones who are descended from those who actually lived this story, how important it is for us to understand what happened, what it's about, and how the Torah really expands from this central story. Okay? So, where do we find ourselves at the beginning of Exodus 12? We are between two plagues, between the 9th plague and the 10th plague. And before, I don't have time now to go through all the 11 chapters that preceded the 12th. I'm hoping that you have a little bit of memory of what happened. Let my people go. Came close a couple of times, but didn't happen. And God really interrupts the sequence of events. So far it's been a lot of let my people go, no. So this plague, that plague. God interrupts the sequence of events to say, wait, just before this next plague, we've got to talk. Before this next plague, we're going to have a discussion about what's going to happen now, because this is the big one, and you all have to prepare. This next plague is going to be determinative, and it's going to be so consequential with regards to its importance for you and for all generations. I need everyone's attention. That's what happens in Exodus 12. It's like the whole story is paused, and God says, prepare yourselves. Something that is transformative is about to occur. Let's start. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. This is what God says to Moses and Aaron in Egypt. The day when this happens is the first day of the month of Nisan. How do we know that? Because in the second verse it says, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first of the months of the year." Chodesh comes from the word chadash. Chadash in Hebrew means new. What's new? The year. What's new? Not the calendar. The moon. That's what it is. The word chodesh, chadash, relates to the new moon. If you look up, God says, and see the sky, you will see a new moon. That's how we know it's the first day of the month of Nisan. And this chadash, this newness, will be not just a new moon, but a new year. The beginning of months. Notice it says, lachem. This month shall be for you. Who is you? Lachem. This is the first time that God really addresses the Jewish people as a people. You're going to be a lachem now, a you. You're going to have your own rituals, your own rules, your own calendar, because you are now a people. So double emphasis on that word, lachem. You will be different. You're going to have your own calendar. So before God starts talking about the Exodus or about the 10th plague or about any sacrifices, two things happen. God distinguishes the Jewish people by identifying them as separate and different from others, something we take for granted. Obviously, we're different, but it should not be taken for granted in the context of the Torah. Even though you could say that the Jewish people in Egypt knew that they were different, it's not clear that that difference manifested in any way in their daily lives. Right? They knew that they had different ancestry. They got their 23andMe test back in the mail. It said, "Oh, you're Jewish," but otherwise their lives were the same. Right? Leaving slavery aside. Right? You were slaves underneath the Egyptian system, including the Egyptian calendar. But now you're going to have your own thing. It begins with calendar. Now, why do you think the first thing that God says to this newly distinguished people is about the calendar? If I was going to say to the Jewish people, your redemption's about to happen, you're going to be free, what's the first thing you would say to them? Think about constitutions of countries and charters of freedoms for peoples. I would probably talk about your rights, your principles, the ideas that will animate you as a people, maybe a bit about your history. But that's not what God decides to address first. So let's put our minds to this question. What do you think the meaning is behind God's first commandment to this group that he distinguishes, lachem, the first commandment being about the calendar? Make this month the first of the months? Any ideas? What's really interesting about time is that we call, like, why is it the year 2021 now? Why is today October the 18th? We call this the secular calendar, but actually the real name of the calendar is the Gregorian calendar. Who is Gregory? Gregory was the name of a pope who established the calendar. The one who determines the calendar has a lot of power, doesn't he? When you control time, you're controlling much more than just what month it says on the page of the calendar. You control when people work and when they don't work. You control when there are convocations and when people are separate, right? You have power to change dates if you don't like them. The one who controls the calendar has a tremendous amount of authority, and it's no surprise that that authority rested in the Pope historically for the secular calendar. It was a way of saying the whole world is subservient in a way to the Roman authority, not just on time, but Roman authority, period. Because when I control time, I control everything. Particularly for a group of slaves. When you talk about when you're working and when you're not working, particularly for a group of slaves, who is in charge of fixed time makes all the difference. This is a group of people whose lives were controlled by Pharaoh's calendar. He says when you do, what you do, everything, all of time, he controls. This is a gift of independence, if you think about it. I'm giving you as a people the first and fundamental, perhaps liberating authority that you will have, and that is you will determine your own time. You decide when the day starts, when it ends, when the months happen, and when they don't. You will not be subservient to anybody. And to go a little bit deeper than that, there are many quotes out there that say, there's nothing more precious in life than time. There are probably 1,000 different versions of that quote, right? Or of that idea. Time is money, you've heard of that, right? What I wouldn't give to have another day, month, year. Controlling time says your most precious value will be yours to determine and own. When you think of time that way, doesn't it start to make sense that the first thing God says to this newly or about to be freed group of slaves is, I am giving you the greatest authority that there is in the world. you will be able to decide what you want to do for yourselves. Your time is yours. This new moon will be the first moon for you. That will be a new Jewish thing. The beginning of the year, you will determine. This is important because, by the way, a lot of Jews, when you ask them, when is the Jewish New Year, they say, Tishrei, last month. That is not true. Judaism has different New Years, just like we do here in Canada. There's the RRSP New Year, there's your tax year, there's your fiscal year, and then there's the year which changes the date. So we have one calendar which is counted from the creation of the world, which is sort of a universal calendar which changes the year. This is the year 5782. That calendar is determined on the first day of Tishrei. But our biblical calendar, where all the holidays, upon which all the holidays depend, when the Bible says the first month, the second month, the third month, you don't count from Tishrei. It's always from the month of Nisan. By the way, there's a lot written on the fact that the month of Nisan, the astrological symbol of Nisan is, anyone know? It's Aries. And what is Aries? Aries is a lamb. So why this month? Well, what is the central symbol of Passover? It's the sacrifice of a lamb. So God says, I want everything the whole year revolving around this event. That's how God introduces Pesach, which goes back to my earlier point asking why we're celebrating Pesach in fall. Why we're learning about Pesach in fall. Because everything in Judaism revolves around this holiday. It's right here in the second verse of Exodus 12. This will be the month that determines everything else. It all starts from the month of Nisan. The month where Jews declared ownership over their time. And there's no ownership more important than ownership over your time. If you don't have your own time, there is nothing else that matters. Who cares if you have a car if you don't have time to drive it? Who cares if you have a dress if you don't have any place to go or the time to go to wear it, right? Etc., etc. If you can't do something with what you have, then why bother having it? Sorry to any hoarders, but that's the idea. It is a prerequisite for all other mitzvot in the Torah. You don't have time to learn Torah? Then you're not going to learn Torah. You don't have time to build a sukkah? You're not going to build a sukkah. Nothing else matters if you don't own your time. Particularly, by the way, Shabbat. Particularly Shabbat. When we say in Kiddush, and we sing about Shabbat, Asher Bacharbanu, what is it? B'Shabbat Kodsho Be'avav Ratzon Hinchilanu Zikaron Lema'aseh Vereshit. God, you've given us the Sabbath as a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. Hold on. What does the Sabbath have to do with the Exodus from Egypt? I thought the Sabbath was introduced at the beginning of Genesis, where God rested on the seventh day. But if God's going to command us to rest on the seventh day, and we're living our lives by some other calendar, then what does God want us to do? If I'm on the Egyptian calendar and the seventh day is a work day, there is no Sabbath day. Unless Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, as a way of understanding Shabbat, does not relate to the Exodus itself, but to this part of the story where God says, before I redeem you, I'm just telling you, part of your redemption will be you decide your own time. Now Shabbat becomes real. Every time we say Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, that's what we're talking about. We have ownership of our time because God gave us that at the Exodus. Even before. The first thing God did, you're going to run your own time yourself, including Shabbat. Everyone with me? Good. By the way, there's no name. If you notice in that verse, there's no name given for that month. It just says, this will be the first of the months of the year. This verse, it's one of those verses that's everyone should know in the Torah, right? Ownership of time being first for establishing Jewish independence and identity. By the way, there's something about this in modern Israel too. A lot of discussion over should the modern state of Israel run according to the secular calendar or run according to its own Jewish calendar. And there's sort of a blend in Israel. But the idea is, as an independent country, Israel can determine its own calendar. So one of the interesting things of Israel is that most people work Sunday to Thursday. Right? That's unique because Israel has its own calendar. We do things our own way. Okay. Verse number 3. Dabru el kol adat Yisrael. You, Moses, go and speak to Adat Yisrael. This is the first time the words Adat Yisrael appear in the Torah. It's not talking about the synagogue down the street. What is Adat Yisrael in the Torah? It's this new thing that God's creating before the 10th plague. A people. The timing of the story of the Exodus from Egypt clearly in the Torah coincides with the creation of the Jewish people as an independent, separate group identity. You're not a family anymore. You're not a genealogy anymore. Now you are a peoplehood, which is something different. A peoplehood is not only a peoplehood because they share DNA, but because they share principles and values. They share core ideas, like common calendar, already introduced. Okay, so go speak to Adat Yisrael, Lemor, and say this. Ba'asor lachodesh hazeh, the 10th day of this month, Vayikhu lahem ish se lebeit avot se labayit. Let me spend some time on this verse. Speak to the whole community of Israel, the 10th of the month, take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. The 10th day of the month. What other holiday do we know of that occurs on the 10th day of the month? Very good. Yom Kippur. So we're seeing a pattern here on the first month that actually gets repeated on the 7th month. The first day of the month of Nisan is the month where God instructs the Jewish people on their new calendar. It's like Rosh Hashanah, right? The 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement, something happens. You may not be familiar with that because we don't do anything today on the 10th day of the month of Nisan. But in the Bible, the 10th day of the month of Nisan is specifically mentioned as a day where you need to go and get your lamb. And the major emphasized word in this phrase is bayit. Se le beit avot. What is beit avot? House of fathers. What would you call that? What's a house of fathers? Today in modern English you call that a family. Se la bayit. One lamb for your house. This verse, which we scroll through in 2 seconds, there's so much in here that should cause lights to go off in your head when connecting these verses to the Passover Seder. You have introduced in this verse an idea that is core to Pesach and unique to Pesach. The idea that something is happening in your family. Some event needs to occur, and you as a family handle it for your family. It's totally new in the Torah, but it's brilliant. Harnessing the power of a family in creating a ritual which we totally take for granted in Judaism and should not, right? You will not find that in every religion. It's amazing how many converts, the first thing they tell me about what they appreciate about Judaism is the emphasis on family. The idea that there are events that happen, Pesach and others, which focus around relatives. The brilliance of the idea is that if you're going to do something that involves transmission, we don't know it yet. But if you're going to do something that involves the transmission of a story, of values, of an identity, there is no more powerful vehicle you have than the relationships of your own family. I hope you agree with that. Nothing more effective at transmitting than when a father tells a child, a mother tells a child, a grandmother tells a grandchild, etc., etc. You will not find any more powerful way of transmitting identity across history than through a family unit. And we skip over this verse like it's nothing. Don't ever do that again. Whenever you read that verse, that's what needs to jump out at you. Oh, now I understand where it comes from. The Jewish emphasis on family gatherings was commanded by God on the night of the Passover. You need to be doing things together as a family. And not just, I don't want to just focus here on the family unit, but also the location where this ritual takes place. It happens in the home. You bring that lamb into your home. Something else we shouldn't take for granted. In the ancient world, where did religion happen? For the most part, it happened in temples. And it's true that the central rituals of Passover occurred when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. It was one of the regalim, the holidays of convocation. But because it says bayit, that part of this ritual will happen in your home, when the temple is destroyed, and a big part of the Passover celebration cannot happen anymore, Passover survives. Because there's an element of this holiday that happens in the home. And whether there's a temple standing or whether the temple's been destroyed, you have a home. And you can observe part of this holiday in your home. Pesach does not get a lot of people in shul. And it always irks me every year. But consistently, it is ranked as the most observed Jewish ritual, period, in Jewish life. Consistently. No matter how assimilated you may consider yourself, Pesach is tops on the list of what I do that is Jewish. And I think a lot of that has to do with this verse. That its focus is not on the temple, but it is introduced as a ritual that occurs within your family and within your home. It makes Pesach easily transportable, both in terms of location and in terms of generation and time, right? It becomes easy to pass down because there's no more effective vehicle for transmitting tradition than within families, and it's easy because there's always a home that you'll have in which to celebrate. Bayit, bayit. Se lebeit avot, se labayit. With me? Okay. I'm sorry if I'm driving you nuts doing this so slowly, but these are big, big, big ideas, and we read through them too quickly. Okay. If the household, I'm in verse 4, if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share. Let him share. I want to just focus on that. Actually, that word share is only implied in the Hebrew. But the implication is obvious. If the household is too small for a lamb, let him share with a neighbor who dwells nearby in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. What is this verse telling us about Pesach or about peoplehood? Am I allowed to celebrate Pesach alone? No. So again, let's pause and think of the power of that idea. A quick verse that we read through like nothing, and what a crazy important principle is being articulated here. There's no such thing as Pesach alone. Nobody can be alone. There's a commandment. If you can't finish a goat, it takes a goat, for a goat or a lamb, most people say, about 12 to 15 people to eat it in one night. and you're not allowed any leftovers. It says that clearly, a couple verses. You can't put it in a plastic bin in the fridge. You got to finish it that night. So if there are not enough people in your household, you're a smaller family, join with somebody else. So not only are we introduced to the principle of never leaving somebody alone to celebrate Pesach, which I think is another crucial idea in establishing peoplehood. How do you establish peoplehood? It's about bonds between people, looking out for those who are vulnerable. Right away, the Pesach is being introduced as a holiday where everyone must be together, even if you're in separate homes. Nobody can be left alone. And not only that, but the idea of sharing as being fundamental to being part of a people. If you want to call yourselves a people, you learn to share. Does a slave share? No. Slave looks after himself. Does someone who doesn't consider himself obligated to family or community share? No. Why should you? Such a person is Darwinian and looks after his own survival or her own survival and disregards the survival of others. But if you're going to be part of a people, you're going to learn that part of what that means is caring about others. And in fact, how many laws are in the Torah just to detail that point? This is how you share at the Passover Seder, but if you look further on, it'll say, and this is how you share your wealth, your resources with those who are needy. Land, etc., etc. Part of being a people is learning resources that belong to everybody. What that means, how to manage them. No one is left alone, and we learn how to share. Now, just to give you a little hint about where we're going to get with this, those of you who are more knowledgeable about the Haggadah, how does the Haggadah begin? Or it doesn't begin with this, but it's right at the beginning. Kol dichvin yete veyichul kol ditzrich. Sound familiar? Let all who are hungry come and eat. It's right at the beginning of the Haggadah. So now you know when I said at the beginning of the class, I don't think we can delve into the Haggadah without first covering the verses that talk about Pesach in the Bible. Now you know why. Because the principles that are articulated in the Haggadah, not all of them, but many of them, flow from the way Pesach is introduced in the Torah. Family, home, it's all in the Haggadah. Sharing, the calendar. So it moves from the Chumash onto the Haggadah. And Halach Ma'anya, that song that I sang, is a great example of how that idea of sharing finds its way into the Haggadah, understanding that it is a central principle of Pesach articulated already in the Torah. I'm going to ask again, is everyone with me? Okay. We have time for some more verses. Let's do verse 5. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. So this verse explains which goat to take or which lamb to take, and obviously it has to be perfect. That's what's being described here. A yearling male, it has to be the best of the best. Why? Because this is for obvious reasons. This is going to be a sacrifice that you make to God. This is something that it's a religious ritual, and when you do religious rituals, it's got to be with the best of the best. Now, how does that transmit to the modern Pesach Seder? We also have this idea that Pesach has to be a holiday where in the home it is celebrated with great luxury. That's the idea of reclining, and everything's got to be the best and fancy and perfect. Why? Because just like that lamb becomes what is desired in an era where we are sacrificing to God, well, our sacrifice is our Pesach Seder. And so it is from this verse that we come to the idea that everything on the Pesach Seder has to be the best, the most elegant. It's an upper class meal. We don't serve God with regular utensils. Okay? Verse 6. V'haya lachem lemishmeret ad 14 yom lachodesh hazeh. So you take the lamb. This lamb will live with you. What's the idea of the lamb living with you? The lamb has to live with you for 4 days, right? Take him on the 10th, he's slaughtered on the 14th. It's sort of creepy to me. It reminds me of when I was younger, my father eats lobster. I never ate lobster. Even when I didn't keep kosher, lobster grossed me out. And one of the reasons why lobster grossed me out is because when I was younger, my dad would go to this restaurant and he would pick the lobster that he wanted. It was this restaurant where you could pick your lobster from the tank, and then it would end up on your plate. And I was just horrified by that, I guess as a child, that I just saw that thing swimming around and living, and now I see you ripping it apart, right? And that's actually what's being commanded here. It's not a lamb that you can take from, just not ask questions about where it came from and let it end up on your plate. You got to get to know this lamb. It's going to live with you for 4 days, and then you'll eat it. What do you think that teaches? I actually don't have an answer to this question. The best answer I found from one of the commentaries is it makes the sacrifice more precious to you. Because you know it, it's more difficult to give it up. You feel in the sacrifice more pain sacrificing that animal. That's the best explanation that I could find, that it makes it more dear to you. But I'm curious to know if anyone else found anything else or has something else to say about it. Yes? Maybe it's that the lamb can't be contaminated. Good point, yeah. Maybe that it's the ownership over the Jewish ownership over the land and over the lamb in some way purifies it or makes it clean. It could very well be. Something else I read is that taking the lamb a few days early was an act of defiance against the Egyptians. So where are they getting the lambs from? They're not getting them from Loblaws. So here they are in Egypt, and God perhaps is testing their will. and saying, let's see how serious you are about leaving. You go a few days earlier before I do this major plague. This I want you to do. Go find a lamb. You got to find a lot of them. And there's archaeological evidence that the lambs were very important to the Egyptians, that they were worshipped by them. There are hieroglyphics with pictures of men with the heads of rams and lambs on them. So, yes?
If you have the lamb for 4 days,
yeah.
what are you doing with the lamb? You're fattening it up. You are
Good.
your resources
Yeah.
to make this lamb more precious.
Right. So that plays into this idea that the lamb is precious because not only is this lamb living with you, but you've used your own resources to care for it. That's excellent. But what I was saying is that everyone understands this other explanation, that this last plague had to be preceded, and there's a lot of merit and I think depth to this argument, that here God was busy doing all the work, but right before the end, God says, I need you to do some work too. I want you to show me that you really want this. And the way you're going to do it is by risking your lives, going to your Egyptian taskmasters and stealing their livestock. Right? And maybe the 4 days was, let's see if you can really do it. So this lamb lives with you for the 4 days, and then v'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael. There's those words again. You will sacrifice this lamb. Who? Kol kahal adat Yisrael. Now they're called a kahal. What's a kahal? A community, a congregation. Now all of you, this congregation, will slaughter that lamb. Bein ha'arbayim. There's a dispute in Jewish law what that means. Bein ha'arbayim. Most sources say it means sometime in the afternoon. Sometime in the afternoon, which is what happened in the temple, by the way. In the temple, on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, pretty much from midday until sundown, until sunset, lambs were brought in order to be slaughtered on the altar. But again, there's no altar here. There's no altar. It's just, you slaughter it. Slaughter the lamb. Do it at home. It's part of the creation of a holiday whose focus is not on some central place of worship, but the home. Emphasized again that idea that this is done by everyone. That also, I should emphasize. So many sacrifices in the Torah are done by some, but not all. The Kohanim, but not anybody else. The Leviim, but not anybody else. We need to emphasize that part of this holiday is equality. There's no mention here of men, no mention of women, no mention of any way that this Kahal Adat Yisrael is divided. Don't just skip that over. That's so important. The idea of inclusivity is not just there in mandating that nobody be left alone for the holiday, but also in mandating that everyone take part in this ritual. So there are many elements of the Haggadah, one in particular that I can think of, that also talk about everybody being there. What's the one that you think I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the 4 children. It doesn't matter if you're wicked. You have to be there. Everyone takes part in the ritual. Pesach is a celebration for everyone. Okay, verse number 7, and then we'll take some questions. V'lakhu min hadam, you take from the blood of the animal, v'natnu al shtei hamizuzot ve'al hamashkof al habatim, asher yochlu oto bahem. You take the blood of the animal, and it's put on the doorposts of your house and the lintel of the house. Okay, let me ask you, what is the importance of blood in Judaism? What do you know about blood in Judaism? Circumcision, good. What else? That's a big one. Let it drain out of the meat. That's right. The blood in the Bible and still today has special status. It's forbidden for consumption. The Torah says, Hadam hu nefesh. The blood is that element of a creature that is called nefesh, that is its core to its livingness. And thus you're forbidden to eat it. When the Passover sacrifice was offered in the temple, the blood was sprinkled on the altar. It is the only part of the animal on Pesach that was not eaten. The rest of it was eaten, had to be eaten, in fact. Just like here it is put on the doorposts of the house. Now, let's go to not eaten, but sprinkled. So let's talk about historically and then later. In this first Seder, there's a question, and this is what I want you to think about. Who's that blood for? So, why are we putting the blood on the doorposts of the house? It will say later, so that God knows that it's a Jewish house. But does that make sense? What do you mean that God knows it? God knows where the Jews are. We know that from other plagues, where it says this plague was on the Egyptians, but it wasn't on the Jews. So this is where I think we get to a core idea of Pesach, and that's where I want to say two things. Okay, let's do this, but there's a core idea of Pesach. Agency. God knows where the Jews live. But there's an element to doing something. Take the blood and put it on your doorposts, which begins here on the first Passover and continues throughout the Torah until today, that I think is about establishing Jewish identity as a religion of agency and action. I'm not going to do, God says, what I did with the other plagues, and basically shield you from them because I like you. This is going to be a different plague. This plague, if you don't obey, you're going to die. If you don't put the blood on your mezuzot, on your doorposts, I don't care if you're Jewish. You will die. You need to show obedience. Show that you care. Show that this is important to you to be saved. The holiday incorporates from its roots an element of we're not just here because we're Jews. We are here because our ancestors did something. And they merited redemption because of what they did. Judaism is a religion of action. You want salvation? God's not going to protect you just because of who your father or mother is. Show that you deserve it. So was that blood a symbol for God? I don't think so. Personally, I don't think so. I don't think God needed to know. I think it was a symbol for them. Pride, defiance in the face of the Egyptians, a sign that I did something to include myself in this new people that is being created called Israel, the congregation of Israel. But back to this idea that blood is not consumed by Jews. Perhaps not consuming blood is remembered at the Seder as it's remembered every time we eat meat. So every time we eat meat, we are aware that there's no blood in the meat. That goes back not just to a commandment in the Torah, but also to an event. That blood was used to show our faith in God. And so it has some holiness to it. Right? But maybe it is remembered at the Seder. Can you think of a time in the Seder where something that looks like blood is spilled? I'm giving it away. Aha. And when is the wine spilled? The 10 plagues. We like to tell a story and say, well, why are we spilling the wine? Because it's like crying for all the plagues of Egypt. That's a later midrash, right? But wine being spilled out, I just can't help but see the connection to wine being spilled on the altars of the temple when the Passover sacrifice was brought, and at the first Seder when the wine was painted or posted on the lintels and the doorposts, a symbol of submission and sacrifice. This is not only one of the most important verses for understanding Pesach, it's also one of the most important verses for understanding Easter, but I'm not teaching that class. You can take that one across the street. But it is fascinating how the Christians interpret all of these verses. Remember, Jesus is the Lamb of God whose blood atones for your sin. But it's the same, we got the same root text. I mean, if you look closely, they're just playing around with the same ideas that have already been part of Jewish tradition for centuries. Blood as a symbol of submission, a symbol of agency, acting on behalf of God. Could see how our Christian friends get carried away with that idea. No judgment. Right? But it is present at our Seder. Blood, some might argue, by the way, that the 4 cups of wine at the Seder remind us of the role of blood in the story of the Exodus originally. But I think certainly when the blood is spilled out, I can't help but connect it to this event. I also thought, by the way, of Elijah's cup. Why give Elijah a cup? So there's a story in the Talmud that there's perhaps a 5th cup, but that's not how it evolved. The story of opening up a door should already make some lights go off in your mind. Oh, a door. Well, doors have a really important role in the Exodus story. So a door is being opened, and wine, which looks like blood, is connected to that door opening. Suddenly things start to connect, right? So we're going to end there. We didn't get far, but we didn't get far in the text. But do you think we got far with some of the ideas? That's what I'm hoping, is that we have gotten far with regards to the foundational ideas of Passover and peoplehood. It's Passover and peoplehood. The two are together, right? That's the theme of today's class. You have to understand that this establishes, the establishment of Passover is also the establishment of Judaism as a peoplehood. Even before we get to the holiday, God says, Lachem, I got something for you as a group. You're going to make your own calendar. You're going to share with each other. You're going to make sure that for your major holiday, nobody's left alone. You're going to make sure that your families are the units in which your stories get passed down. 7 verses, not bad for density in the Torah. Are there any questions? I know we're a bit late. Okay, can I just ask, for the benefit of those viewing on live stream, that questions be asked in the mic? Okay. 2 questions.
First one is, if the story of Pesach that we talked about thus far is so pivotal to Judaism, how is it that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are designated as the high holidays? It seems to be like the climax and the emphasis in our year. That's the first question. So how
Yes.
does that evolve? And the other one is, with respect to blood, how does the holiness and the idea of blood being pure and all of its connotations that you've described,
Yep.
how does that then contrast with a woman's monthly cycle and the blood and then it's impure?
Interesting. I don't think that, let me start with the second question first. I don't think it's blood that renders a woman impure. Impurity in Judaism is always connected to death. So there's an idea that a woman's monthly cycle is like life and death happening inside of her. And death is always connected to impurity. That's why a Kohen can't go to a cemetery. It's not blood, it's the idea of blood representing the death of something that causes impurity. That's your second question. The first question, what about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Rosh Hashanah is hardly mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in one verse, maybe, as a day of convocation. Not even in the Torah. I think it's in the book of Psalms. As a day of blasting, it's mentioned as. Probably Rosh Hashanah, this is a longer lecture. Probably Rosh Hashanah did not exist in biblical times. They blew a shofar to change the new year, and that's it. There was no liturgy, nothing else. It probably became a bigger holiday after the return of the exiles, because there's a lot in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah about how that was the month when there was a rededication of reading Torah. Now they came back from the Babylonian exile, and Jewish life sort of started over again, and we mark that starting over again of Jewish life with a holiday that today is called Rosh Hashanah, or Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Memory. But in the time of the temple, there's no evidence really that Yom Kippur that Rosh Hashanah was celebrated at all. Later in Rabbinic Judaism, Rosh Hashanah gets conflated with judgment. The idea that God sits on the throne of judgment at that time of year, and that turns Rosh Hashanah into a much bigger holiday than it ever was. How that happens is complicated. And deserves its own real lecture that I've given before, actually, on how the idea of God sitting on the throne of justice on Yom Kippur relates to Rosh Hashanah, and how the two really become bookends in a theme of judgment which the month of Tishrei encapsulates. Yom Kippur, in the time of the Bible, is a holiday for purity, probably observed only in the priestly circles of Jerusalem. We know that from the Mishnah of Yom Kippur, that the major rituals of Yom Kippur had to do with goats. One that was sent off to carry away the sins of Israel, and another that was offered on the altar as the sacrifice of Yom Kippur. But what's missing from both holidays is any sense of convocation, that people were brought together. That exists for Pesach. Pesach is a holiday of convocation. Or any home rituals. So, which does exist for Pesach. Pesach, as we saw, buy it, it's right there at the beginning. So only over time, I think particularly in the modern world where the synagogue becomes the place where our religion happens, do Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur become more important. But biblically, they were minor holidays, if observed at all. There's a good case to be made that Rosh Hashanah was nothing. It was just a blast of a shofar. It's a new year. Mazel tov. That's it. Other questions? Then I will see you, hopefully in person, next Monday at 9:45 with God's help. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ricky.